What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Cars, Bikes, and Coffee. I am Kurt, and we are working on a 1992 Nissan 300ZX twin turbo. And in previous episodes, we've been working on sealing up the engine. It's over 30 years old, and so we need to tend to those leaks. And what we're working on today is the back of the engine. So what we need to do is drop the transmission. So let me take you underneath the car and show you where I'm at. Underneath the car, we've already removed the exhaust and heat shields and the drive shaft, and we've also drained the transmission of fluid, and we've pulled off the slave cylinder for the clutch and pulled off the starter. So, and we also removed the pre-cat on the passenger side here. So now what we need to do is go ahead and get the transmission supported and then undo the remaining bolts of the bell housing, and then as well the transmission cross member. And then that will allow us to drop the transmission. I do need to unplug some of the sensors off the transmission, but other than that, I think we're ready to go. I went ahead and undid everything on the shift boot, and we've removed this side of the transmission mount, the bolts, and just loosened this side. And that was able to, with the jack support, to get the bolts off the top, just at the right angle, to get a swivel and a 3-foot extension on each of the sides. So now we're ready to drop. So I'm going to take those 3 bolts out, and then I'm going to slowly lower the transmission, pushing it back, of course, away from the motor, and then I'm going to take it out the front. So we've got the transmission out and the clutch off, and I'll show you guys that in a minute, but I wanted to show you this easy trick for when you don't have a torque gun to get your flywheel off, and that's simply putting one of the transmission bell housing bolts back in and one of the flywheel bolts back in, and then one of an open end socket, and then you take, and I've already loosened this one up, but then you take your wrench, whoops, and then that will hold it in place and won't let the engine spin. Flywheel is out, and look at that. We have a leaking rear main seal. So I'm gonna clean this up, replace that, and everything else is looking good. So let me show you all the things we pulled out. All right, so we've got a lightened flywheel, and it's looking fairly good. Couple burn marks, but overall not too bad. Clutch has a few bits of life left, looking pretty good. Just a little bit of dust and cleanup, and then this guy needs a serious bath. So we've got lots of oil in there. I'm going to check the bearing in a little bit, but just an overall clean. And we're going to change the shifter to a short shifter by AMS, and so that'll be nice. Get this cleaned up, all this set, and back in. We've gone ahead and changed out the rear oil main seal, and as well changed the coolant line up here, and then rewrapped the harness to the starter and gave it some heat tape, and then cleaned up the grounding strap up above. So now what we want to do is get the flywheel clean and the clutch cleaned, and then work on the transmission. So we've got the flywheel cleaned, and we're going to get that on. And we'll always want to make sure your plate behind the flywheel is on if you have that on your car, because it's no fun to redo this. We got Loctite on the bolts, so I'm going to go ahead and finger tight all these, snug them up, and then torque them to spec. When you're doing the flywheel and you're torquing them down to spec, and obviously the engine really isn't locked and it'll just free spin, take a open end wrench and put in one of your clutch pressure plate bolts and then one of your transmission bolts. Make sure they're screwed in several threads, and then this will push against, and you want to go in the direction or the opposite direction of what you're turning. So we're going to turn it this way, so this will stop the flywheel from turning. If I can do this with one hand, then I can tighten it and then torque it. And so now with the flywheel torqued, I'm going to just go ahead and clean it with some brake clean one more time, and then we'll go ahead and put in the clutch. We've got the flywheel in and the clutch, and so we are ready to set up the transmission for install. The stock ZX transmission had a stamped steel clutch fork, and we're going to upgrade this to the Z71 cast iron clutch fork. And basically this is a 2003 plus 350Z transmission clutch fork design essentially. So went ahead and installed the updated pivot ball, and then of course we have our throwout bearing that we've greased. Just need to grease this up and then get that installed, and also a new boot, keep out the moisture. I'm just using a liquid moly. This has graphite because it's engine assembly lube. Push that on. All right, now we're ready to get this onto the car. Finagled the transmission under, and I had to use some moving sliders to get it under. I didn't jack the car high enough, so next time, hopefully there's not, but I'm gonna either get a low profile jack or better yet, a transmission jack. So if you have a favorite, let me know down in the comments. So now what I need to do is lift up the transmission and get it installed, and then we can work on getting the drive shaft and the exhaust. So we've got the transmission back in, even got the drive shaft, put the starter, torqued all the bolts. And so what we need to do now is put the heat shield and the exhaust back in and just clean up underneath the car just a little bit more and get it all nice and clean, and then we can move on to the next steps. So now that we have the transmission installed, what we want to do is go ahead and install our shifter, and we're going to go ahead and upgrade from our stock, probably broken shifter, in an install AMS short shifter, which will give us a lot smoother. And also notice that we don't even have the nylon bushings on the stock one, so that was one of the problems. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this installed, and then I'll meet up. All right, so we've got the drivetrain pretty much in, so now what we need to do is work on the exhaust. And this is a real nice B&B stainless steel exhaust, but looks like garbage, so I wanna really clean it up. There were no gaskets at all in this exhaust line, so they just used some exhaust RTV basically and sandwiched it all together. So I'm going to clean it up, and then I'm using a toilet bowl cleaner, which is basically hydrochloric acid, and scrub this all down and use a plastic scraper to get some of the tar and the rocks that are stuck on here with that tar. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and we'll see what this looks like after. And another thing that looks 1,000 times better. So definitely recommend using a toilet bowl cleaner and scrub it. Use a kind of like a Brillo pad, maybe on a drill, and that way it'll get off all of the oxidation that occurs on the pipes. But this looks 1,000 times better. There's still a few parts that I'm gonna hit with maybe a Dremel brush. All right, so now with the exhaust, at least the stainless steel cleaned, we can now put the cats back on. We have new gaskets and as well bolts, and I should say we have gaskets now because we didn't before. So now we're gonna go ahead and just loosely put these on piece by piece and then tighten it all down. All right, so we've got the exhaust in, and one thing we found out was that the rear tow hook was bent and actually a bolt ripped out. So went ahead and ordered that part offline, basically eBay. And so now what I want to do is start getting the suspension together. So I'm going to show you some parts that we just got from AMS that are going to really take this to the next level. Got the rear control arms, we've got the tension rods, and this is what the tension rods look like. They were aftermarket, but they're rusted. And we also are replacing these as well, as those are rusted. Here's the difference on the upper control arms on the front. I mean, these were probably great back in the day, but they're rusted, so I'm glad we're going to the AMS. So we're gonna get these on the car and the rest of the suspension. So we wanna go ahead while the car is on the jack stands is get all the suspension updated. And then we also, since we took all the brake equipment off, master cylinder needs to be replaced. Brakes on the front need to be put on. and that way we can get this to be on wheels and tires. So the other thing we also did off camera is we changed the fluid in the differential, and then we also, of course, added fluid to the transmission. All right, so we've got the upper control arm installed, and also the tension rod, and also the rotor and the brake caliper. So we are set on the front suspension now. So now I'm going to put the control arm on the rear, and then we need to put on the master cylinder. And then I'm also going to have the reservoir for the power steering fluid powder coated. So I need to drain some more of the fluid and then pull that out so I can get that to the powder coater. But it's coming together. So we got the master cylinder in, all things are good there, so I just need to bleed the system, so we'll do that in a little bit. But as I was preparing to remove the reservoir for the power steering, I noticed we've got some leaking going on the return line that goes to a hard line, and the rubber hose is fitted to that. So what I want to do is pull that hard line out. I have a silicone hose coming, but I want to change the way that the early 93 to 90 used the hard line with a fitted rubber hose, and I'm going to change the hard line to have a barb so I can just run a hose like the 94 and up. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that line out. It goes up underneath the radiator and to the side, so I'm going to need to drain the system fully and then pull that line out. All right, so as I was undoing the bolts from the hard line, that's the return to the reservoir, and I took the reservoir out, I got to thinking, instead of taking this line out, I'm going to go in and actually, if you can see it, is cut the crimp, and I should be able to pry that open. So what I did is I used my Dremel with a tiny cutoff wheel, because that's all I could fit in there, and then I'm going to go ahead and pry that open, and that crimp should come off because they do barb or make a ridge for the hose anyways, so maybe I can utilize that. So I'm going to cut that off, and then we'll touch base after that. All right, so we got it cut off, and that Dremel has come in handy many times on this car, but just cut the crimp in half and then use 2 wrenches to pry these pieces apart, and they just fall off. So now what we can do is use a silicone hose from that line to the reservoir, and we're good. So we got one of the last few, at least C1 Motorsports had, for the return line. Paid $70 shipped for this thing. Cannot believe it. Wish someone made these in silicone. And yes, I do have the delete kit for the high cast system, so I want to try this first, see what it's like, and then I'll look at deleting it. But for now, we're going to put this in, and then finally, what started most of all of this work is the radiator. So let me go grab the radiator. So we've got the AMS radiator and then also the silicone hoses. So we'll want to go ahead and put this in as well and then get it filled up. And I also am going to be putting in a separate water temperature sensor in between the lines, so we're going to need to cut that and put the adapter for that. All right, so we've got the radiator in and our hose to our power steering, and we're battling with some weather here, but we're going to fill up the radiator using one of these, which these are awesome. They're cheap and they're great to use. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up, and then we'll go from there. Just going to check we're not leaking. All right, so what we have been working on behind the scenes on the ZX is flush the clutch, flushed the brake fluid reservoir, including the ABS, and I went to fill up the power steering fluid with ATF, and wouldn't you know it, I started to leak. So the J-hose is bad and old, so I went ahead and ordered a new one and replaced it. But we've got that all updated and everything pretty much connected. And so what we want to do now is connect just a normal 5/16 hose to the fuel outlet, and I want to drain this gas. So I have a container that I'll set up and prop up, and then we will turn on the ignition. I'm going to pull the ignition coil fuse out, or relay, and then that way I don't have the engine turning over or getting hot. So let's go ahead and drain the gas. All right, so we've got the battery in, and I just want to show the grounding wire. Someone had asked, can you show where it's connected? So the grounding wire I added is right here on the connector to the battery, runs along here and connects down below right here to the strut tower, and then it goes back right this grounding strap for the engine, then goes to this grounding strap for the engine, and then comes to this side of the engine, and then right down to this strut tower. So now we've got a line to our tank, and we're going to turn on the ignition to see if we can pump out the bad fuel. All right, so after some light reading with the fuel pressure control unit down here, and we're in the back of the ZX, it came to me that it would be easier just to disconnect the fuel pump, which is on this side, and the fuel sender is on this side. But I'm gonna ground this black wire, which is the ground for the fuel pump. And then I have my little positive, negative auto probe, and I'm gonna give the line with the white and purple power. And there we go. Now my only concern of doing it this way would be, of course, burning the fuel pump. So I'm gonna try and run this in stages and let it rest and cool off. But we should be getting all this gas out. All right, so we've got all the fuel drained from the ZX, and now what I want to do is remove the front bumper cover, and I want to do that because I want to change to silicone hoses on the intercoolers, and I might want to change the intercoolers as well. So let's get this off. There's just a few bolts on either side, and we already have most of the parts off, like the under tray and obviously the fog lights and the turn signals. So this should be fairly easy. There's a couple bolts in here. Then there's two right up in here in the turn signal. Huh, I'm missing one. And then we have 4 up here. All right, so we've got both sides bolts off. We removed the little plastic grommet holding the side bumper bracket. It should, by design, just come right off. So now with the front bumper cover off, we can see the small stock intercoolers and a lot of dust and dirt. So I'm gonna go ahead and hose and clean this all up, and then go ahead and remove the intercoolers and the hoses, and then we'll take a look at what we're gonna put in. All right, so as you can see, we've got the intercoolers out and actually cleaned them up, and so we're gonna go from something of this size to something of this size. So this will definitely cool the air a lot better. It's about, I don't know, what, 1 3/4 the size, so 1 1/2. So this will do much better. So we have all new silicone hoses from CZP, Concept Z Performance. So we're gonna get that installed and get this all set so we can give it a test run. With the old gas drained, and then I went ahead and added some 91 octane. That's all we can get here in California, but as far as added about 2 gallons. And so now what I need to do is get the fuel pump to prime and then load those injectors, and we should be able to start. We've done a lot of work since, so hopefully nothing goes wrong. Fingers crossed. The amount of times that I've done this, I always get nervous when I start an engine, but here's hoping for the best. Gonna cycle it a couple times. Couple things. It didn't start because I had to clean the PTU terminals again. So we did that, and then it was running rough on 5 cylinders, and I figured out it was the number 6 cylinder and the driver's side back. And so I forgot to plug in the fuel injector. So plugged it in, runs good. So now what I want to do is use my DIY smoke test, and I'm going to see if we have any vacuum leaks, and at least alleviate that we've got all the hoses fixed and all the connections are tight before we drive it around, so, and move it around too. So hook this up and then I'll show you if we have anything. Hopefully we don't. All right, so a little bit of leak here, but we're running through the intake and we've got something down here. So we'll need to figure out what is leaking here. This side seems to be okay. Let's get a flashlight for that. All right, we're running again. It was the bottom intake, wasn't tightened. I forgot, apparently. So now we're gonna let this run and see if there's any other smoke. The only other clamp was this one right here that just needed to be tightened, and everything else looks good. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and start it up. Sounds pretty good. Well, that's all the time I have, so we are going to start working on the exterior and clean up some of these bits too in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good one.